I'm sure some of you are saying, what, two panels right in a row, but this one is going to be the one that is different from the others. The wonderful thing about these day-long conferences with lots of speakers is that you get a wide variety of viewpoints and it's all stimulating. The one negative thing is that sometimes it's really hard to kind of process and draw out big themes. And so just as I have prevailed upon Alina and Greg to kind of do double duty, two of our other panelists, Derek Mitchell and Joseph Liow, have graciously acceded to my request that they kind of just give a few closing remarks. What themes came out, what might have surprised them, what they thought key takeaways from the day might have been. So obviously we have a Southeast Asian perspective and perhaps an American one. And I realize we've been going in this direction, but perhaps we'll let guests go first and start with Joseph, who is flying in and out in just about less than 24 hours to be here today. So
only from Singapore. Though.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, only from Singapore.
Thanks,
you,
Anne-Marie. Okay, let me kickstart this final session by saying that you asked me to try to provide a Southeast Asian perspective. I think one thing we take away from today is that there is no Southeast Asian perspective, right? There are perspectives from different Southeast Asian states. So it's quite different. But nevertheless, let me maybe highlight a few things that I thought was interesting and my reflection on these issues. The first is Southeast Asia itself, right? The theme of this conference, Trump 2.0 in Southeast Asia, very timely theme for a number of reasons. One of which is that if you look at the Indo-Pacific, most of the countries have been accounted for as far as alignments are concerned. Yeah, Japan, Australia, South Korea, North Korea, Taiwan. Yeah, set aside India, you have Southeast Asia, where in a sense it's up for grabs, right? And this is something that we sort of touched on quite a bit in our discussion. Why does it matter who or which direction Southeast Asia leans towards? I think it matters because, number one, for some countries in the region, it's a question of security or insecurity, the difference between security and insecurity. We had some discussion about choosing diplomacy over security or allusions to that. I'm all for diplomacy, but the best way to pursue diplomacy is to have strong deterrence. Yeah. And what we learn from the literature is that if you can't deter a potential adversary on your own, the next best option is alliances. Yeah. And alliance by choice. In other words, states do exercise agency in choosing to enter into an alliance. Yeah. So we shouldn't think that simply because the Philippines is in an alliance relationship with the United States, it has basically sold its interest to the U.S. It's a very calculated, committing to an alliance is a very calculated move on the part of both parties. Yeah. So one difference between security and insecurity. Second is a difference between rich and poor. Yeah. During the Cold War, the countries that aligned with the United States essentially grew rich under the security umbrella provided by the US Today, obviously, that narrative has shifted. People are thinking about how China can be the growth engine for the region, and has, in the not too recent past, or in fact, in the recent past, has proven to be a growth engine for Southeast Asia. Yeah, and number three, choice in terms of the difference between status quo and equidistance. Now, I think people make the mistake to interpret Southeast Asia's reluctance to choose as the regions or the regional states' preference for equidistance between the US and China. That is not the case, I would submit to you. When Southeast Asian states say they don't want to choose, what they're basically saying is we're pretty comfortable where we are. And ideally, we would like not to move too far from where we are. Now, where we are is at very different stages, or if you think in terms of a spectrum, US and China, where they stand is very different. Some lean a bit sort of towards one, some lean a bit towards the other, some lean more towards one or the other. But regional states, having been in that position more or less over the last 20 years, find that their comfort zone. Yeah, of course, we can have a discussion about whether it's realistic to think that that is, whether that can continue. But to me, the fact of the matter is, not wanting to choose means this is where we would like to be located, all things being equal. So that's the first thing out of this question of alignment. The second point I thought was quite interesting I think it was the last panel about China taking advantage of US distraction. And we have seen that before, right? 9/11 and the years immediately after 9/11, when the US, I mean, you recall the Bush administration, Bush 43, came in saying that China is going to be a strategic competitor, right? And then about a few months after that, 9/11 happened, and the entire list of priorities changed. Yeah, and what happened was the United States. I wouldn't use the term distracted. I mean, it was a major priority, but the United States' focus was on the Middle East, counterterrorism, and all that sort of stuff, right? And what that did was create an opportunity which the Chinese latched onto by becoming essentially the engine of regional growth for 10 years for Southeast Asia. Yeah, they stole the march on the charm offensive on the US. Now, the question is whether that could happen again. Maybe, maybe not. We have to wait and see. But one interesting dimension that is different now, though, and that is that the question of Chinese overcapacity and the lack of access to the markets that matter most, or the reduced access that the Chinese have to the markets that matter most for them, which is basically the United States and Europe, yeah, because of tariffs. What that means is that the Chinese have to find other markets, and we saw one presentation flash the trade figures between China and ASEAN. Right, ASEAN is now China's largest trading partner. That's great news, but that also means that a lot of Chinese overcapacity is going to come into ASEAN, and it's going to challenge, it's going to be a threat. It's going to be an economic threat to a number of ASEAN countries for whom manufacturing is a priority for them. Yeah, so we need to, so it's not going to be so straightforward, I think, in terms of China taking advantage of the sort of lack of attention that the US is giving the region. And the last point I would make is about ASEAN. And we had a lot of discussions about ASEAN. We had a presentation about ASEAN. this question, this issue of whether or not ASEAN can seize upon the opportunity now to really define their role in a region that is becoming more dynamic, and where the architecture itself is starting to shift, right? Or at least the ground under it is starting to shift. I think it should. I hope it does. But at the same time, we all realize that there are some substantial obstacles, and certainly in terms of the short term, and I would say over the next 2 years or so, maybe until the midterm elections in the U.S., you're going to see far more bilateral activity between individual Southeast Asian states and the United States than you will see any substantive multilateral activity. I think we should take a leaf from the Vietnam playbook, right? The Vietnamese have a pretty clear idea of how they want to approach the Trump administration. And, you know, whatever you think about the man and how distasteful he is, when it comes to realpolitik, you know, you do what you have to do for the interests of your country. So I think you will see quite a bit of movement on that. Those who the regional countries who can come to terms with this new reality faster will be able to get more done. Yeah, in this context. Yeah. A last point I wanted to raise about public opinion on China. Yeah. So there was some discussion about elite opinion and public opinion. I think to some extent, public opinion on China, which is not very high across Southeast Asia, has less to do with the South China Sea. I mean, a lot of South, you know, sort of the regular people on the street don't quite know where the South China Sea is, may not quite know what's at stake there. For them, and this is based on quite a bit of anecdotal encounters I've had, it's simply just their personal interactions with Chinese who are in Southeast Asia. Yeah, I think there's a perception that the Chinese, not unlike the Western, those from Western cultural backgrounds in the past, come to Southeast Asia with a sense of cultural superiority. Yeah, and this is something, and this is why small countries in Southeast Asia, like I said, you know, no one's benign as far as we're concerned, whether it's the US or China. Big powers think like big powers. Yeah. They cannot think otherwise, or else they will not be big powers. Yeah. So there is that perception gap between them and Southeast Asian states. The problem is we, as small powers, are very sensitive to how big powers deal with us. Big powers don't think twice about how they deal with small countries. Yeah, so I think we need to bear that in mind when it comes to public opinion, not just in relation to China, but in relation to the United States, Japan, etc. as well. Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been quite a day, long day. We're almost at 5 o'clock, or just before 5 back here in New York. Those in Washington watching, but I'm thinking about people who are streaming somewhere else. I was tempted. Well, first of all, thank you, Anne-Marie. I want to thank all the folks who organized. Of course, Leanne, who is not here, but Susie and Maya and Julie and the rest. So thank you for organizing all those in the back and elsewhere. Is that Leanne back there? Actually, Leanne is back there. I was tempted to answer the question on Myanmar, but I'm not going to. Maybe we can have a whole other session on talking about Myanmar and what can be done with the region. I thought it was an interesting question about the sort of triumvirate being brought together by Malaysia. But just a few things, just extending on what Joseph just said. Look, there was a wide range of perspectives put on the table today, and that I think reflects the fact of how diverse this region is. what we heard were both, thank goodness, opportunities as well as challenges. And for those Americans who are, most of us, everybody in this room probably spends a lot of their time bemoaning what's going on in America right now. And we're quite depressed about it all. And it's good every once in a while to have Asians, and we get it all the time from friends, even from Myanmar, who are going through whatever, terrible things. They'll come visit and say, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. You'll get through this. And these are people from Myanmar going through a coup, telling Americans it'll be all right. But, right now we have a lot of unpredictability in the United States. I mean, I come out of this, I think is what comes out of this day is more questions than answered. We came into this with a bunch of questions and things we posed, but we don't come out of it with that much more elucidation, but we do have a sense, at least of the context in Southeast Asia. But it's still the case that there are cross currents in the U.S. government. There's a great deal of unpredictability about where our policy is going to land. I think we can be certain probably of this tariff thing that's going to happen. What is it, April 2nd, he talks about his Liberation Day, which could, I think some of us think is a second April Fool's Day, maybe, but it's likely to come where it's going to be played with. It's just unpredictable. We won't know if this administration is going to double down on Asia, or is it going to disengage from Asia? Is it going to be spheres of influence? We go and work on the Western Hemisphere, and Europe, Russia takes Europe. I mean, crazy thoughts, and China, whatever that is, a kind of sphere of influence generally. Or is there going to be a China, both of which have challenges for Southeast Asia? And you've always had to be worried about a G2, the whole elephants thing that comes up all the time. When the elephants elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and then there was the elephant make love, the grass gets trampled. And I always had a third, which, forgive me for this illusion, I'm not sure it actually works as a metaphor, but you get my idea. I had this like 20 years ago. But when the elephants engage in a pissing contest, the grass grows. But I never could quite roll that out because it's not really a right metaphor. But when you water the grass, it grows. In other words, competition is good, but fighting and making love are probably not good. So, the region has to figure out, and Southeast Asia is pretty adept. There's nothing entirely new about the situation Southeast Asia is in. I mean, the skepticism towards the United States, the uncertainty about the U.S. is, there. The realpolitik perspectives of the region have always been there. The question we have is this different somehow? If so, how is this different the next 6 months, the next 4 years? How far does that realpolitik go? And the question I've asked for 20 years, ever since the post-Iraq moment, I asked this of Chan Hung-chi when I was inaugurated the Southeast Asia program at CSIS. I said, is there a floor beyond which the United States can go in its relationship with Southeast Asia? Because of the fundamental basis of the relationship, which is you're concerned about China. You've got a major power in your border. You need to get along with, you want to take advantage of the huge market, the huge opportunities, but you're never going to be confident about your sovereignty in the shadow of that enormous power. So that still maintains. I mean, we don't want to test this, but is there a floor beyond which we can go, and will realpolitik prevail somehow? And what is exactly at risk? What if we ask the region to choose? What if we do go that length of really, I know the first administration did to a degree, they're going to start turning up that dial, I think, in the second Trump term of choosing. You must not have Huawei. You must maybe RAM. You can't do, if you do this with China, you can't do this with us, and therefore you're making a choice. How far do they go with that, and what's at stake in that? I thought it was very interesting. Oh, and also just, will this push the region together, or will it push them apart? There was a little talk of ASEAN coming together. It's the dream always of small powers of Singapore, that we're stronger together. But there are big powers. Indonesia has its own dream, or Vietnam has its own internal issues and such. Will they make separate deals? Will it push them together? And who will lead that effort, if anyone? So there's still that question of the region. Will fall apart bilaterally, each making its own deal, will be pulled together. And I thought it was a fascinating question from our Philippine friend, who said, he was saying, is the destruction of the old order such a bad thing? Is it forcing us now to look at objectively what we need to do to step up? Is this good for us to wake us up to having been reliant on this great power for so long? Look, I have my view, and the region will have to come to their conclusion themselves in individual countries. We're not there simply because we're pushing our way around. We're invited in by the Philippines, as Greg will make, will say ad nauseum, and others. We're there because we provide a service. We provide that balance, that offshore balance, and that sense that we're not simply reliant on this great power to the north, and we have options. But is the destruction of the old order actually good, and what does a new order look like if the U.S. is not quite as present or as reliable as before? These are open questions. But the bottom line was, Southeast Asia has agency. They will be making these decisions themselves, as is correct, as appropriate. We talk about the global South or the lesser developed or the developing countries. That is where the United States, I think, was headed with Biden and should be headed, which is we need to give these countries more of a voice. And in return, these countries need to take more responsibility for their choices. Even the choice of having relations with both is a choice. But having their own agency and choice is actually, I think, a healthy thing and is logical in this 21st century world, and something the United States has needed to adapt to, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Africa and elsewhere. We have to open the aperture. We're not a hyperpower. I think Trump thinks we're still a hyperpower. We're not. And we're going to get probably disabused of that notion pretty quickly as nations choose other things other than having to accommodate the United States. We're not what we used to be. But ideally, even in this gap, the other countries or the developing countries will have agency. And then this final question is, will our allies, we talked about that today, will our allies step up? Japan, Korea, Australia, India, other partners of ours who also have agency, who have their own interests. Europe, will they be less inclined to be engaged in Asia because they're focused now more at home? It's a big question. We'd hope to have Europe more engaged in the balance in Asia. They may be distracted. But it's better if they all decide on their own it is in their interest to engage, because there are still interests that we all have in common, even if the United States is going to work against their own interest in the next 4 years.
Well, it was suggested that might change after the midterms, so maybe it's only 2. But just a small point. Thank you both very much for tying that all up together. I thought the questions that, the issues that Joseph laid out, and then your questions, even if there is no answers and there's still a lot of certainty, the questions that have been laid out give us a guidepost to look at as things develop over the next months and maybe years, to help determine that. So on that note, I want to thank both Derek and Joseph for helping us sum up the conference. I would like to thank all of the panelists who participated today. I would like to thank all of you for coming and hanging into the very end. It's always hard to talk to an empty room. So that is great. And I would like to invite everybody to a small reception in room 918, the Weatherhead Conference Room in the International Affairs Building. Regrettably, we couldn't do it here because the J School has a policy of not having wine when students are present. So anybody who's over the age of 21 can come join us at the reception. So please thank all of you, all of the panelists. It was a great day.